Something that's really exciting to me about this presentation specifically is that it's for the backyard gardener. Like, it is for the novice mushroom grower, the person that wants to get into mushrooms, that's never even dabbled in mushrooms yet. It's hopefully going to be so applicable that each of you will walk away with some sort of knowledge about how you can literally inoculate your garden bed this year. All right, so a little bit of background. Danielle always my wife tells me to add this because I'm really bad about like giving my background, and she's always like, some random dude up here talking about mushrooms, it looks so weird. But so I like to call myself a citizen mycologist, and I really am a promoter of citizen science. I think citizen scientists are going to be the ones that change the world. They're going to be the ones coming from grassroots situations that are literally experimenting, that are doing the hard work, and kind of promoting the anecdotal evidence rather than just like going purely scientifically based and then getting into it. So I like to see citizen scientists as more of artists than scientists almost. So my form of citizen science is citizen mycology, and mycology is just the study of mushrooms. So basically I'm just a person that got really into mushrooms for random reasons, that got so excited about it. I like to say that I got inoculated, and now I'm obsessed and I can't stop thinking about it. And I mean, I'll wake up at like 2 a.m. and be like just thinking of the weirdest obscure questions, and I'm like, I just need to like dive into this rabbit hole. So mushrooms will tend to do that to you. We started Breads and Botanicals 2 years ago now. That was a cafe in Saguache, and we were focusing on all local organic ingredients for the food. Really, our heart is in food production, though. Like, my wife is a dedicated farmer. I've turned into a dedicated mushroom farmer, which has really changed my view of what farming is, which I also want you all to get from this concept as well. This is a really cool style of farming because it's vertical farming. It can be done indoors or outdoors. It's low water usage, low energy usage, pretty passive. The implications to it, though, are massive. Like the bioremediation projects that can happen, the amount that we can build more soil quickly, sequester carbon, biodiesel, mycomaterials like building materials, literally like myco leathers, everything. Mushrooms can save the world. And I like to say that like wherever there is mycelium, there is hope. And I really truly feel that in my heart. Whenever I lift up a stump and I see that white, I'm just like, that is my hope. Like, I have hope for this planet. I know that these things will actually allow us to bioremediate all of the synthetic things that we've done to this planet to like toxify all of our environments. They're one of the few things that can bioremediate on this level. So that alone has drawn me to them. Their medicinal benefits, their benefits to me as a person, the implications are profound. So what we're doing now is, as Jay said, we're expanding into a full-time mushroom production. I think I'm going to be able to triple my current production. I want to wholesale to Valley Roots Food Hub. Ultimately, it's going to be able to get us these mushrooms to people cheaper. People have constantly asked us like if they can buy them on EBT. They're going to be able to buy them on EBT at the Cloud, at Saguache Works, at Simple Foods. We really want to get these out to as many people as possible because it's really important that we start consuming more mushrooms. General terminology. I'm just going to quickly glance over these so that it's not super overwhelming and you don't hear some random term and just totally lose me. So a spore is basically the seed of the mushroom. It's the reproductive unit. It's blasting off of the bottom of the mushroom typically. Typically, you would see a basidiomycete, which has gills. Those gills are blasting off a lot of spores. Like, there's estimated over hundreds of trillions of spores potentially per fruiting patch of oyster mushrooms, which is like almost unfathomable. Anyways, the spore is the reproductive unit of the mushroom. It's meant to be carried by winds and colonize in the soil or on logs or various different substrates to break down those substances. Mycelium is the spores mating and forming threads underground or on a log or something that it's decomposing. So the mycelium is basically when spores have mated. It's not always this way, but typically spores will mate. They'll form fungal hyphae and start to spread mycelium. And that is the white. That's like the white that you would see. This is a spawn bag that I'll explain later. But this is an example of fully colonized mycelium. And it's an oyster mycelium, so it's very thick, and I'll explain that later too. Fruiting bodies are the mushrooms themselves. It's kind of weird that they call them fruiting bodies, but that's just what it is. And a lot of people lose me on that term, but it's just mushrooms. That's just what it means. It's just the mushroom that you see. The substrate is exactly what you would see here. This is the inoculated substrate, and the substrate is whatever the mushroom is growing off of. So this could be a log, it could be an insect, it could be a dead animal, it could be a dead human. The possibilities are endless with mushrooms. They will decompose everything. Inoculate, that is to add either spores or mycelium to a substrate so that they can expand and grow out. That's all that means. Colonize is when the mycelium is growing out. That's all that means. Spawn is a fully colonized bag that you would inoculate your garden with or inoculate other bags with. So spawn is basically just ready to go stuff that you can break up and use in your compost or garden. And I'll explain that in detail later. Live culture, I really don't need to explain this, to be honest. It's just a mycelium living in a liquid or some sort of like medium that it feeds on. The liquid culture is the mycelium suspended in a liquid. Fresh air exchange is going to be really important when you're growing specifically. Fresh air exchange is your amount of oxygen versus your amount of carbon dioxide. Something to think about is that mushrooms produce a massive amount of carbon dioxide typically require a really large amount of oxygen in order to stay strong into fruit. This is not as typical with like mycorrhizal species, but I'm talking specifically about the ones that we're cultivating out and the ones that you'll see fruiting out in the wild. So the fresh air exchange is just FAE. It's the amount of O2 relative to, amount of the oxygen relative to the CO2. The tech is the specific type of growing technique. That's all that refers to. I don't know why they put a K in there, but most people use the K. Mycorrhizae is basically what I was explaining with the fungus root, but it's more so explaining the relationship between fungi and plant roots specifically. Getting started. You guys can do it. It is mad easy to cultivate mushrooms. Just don't overthink it. There's a million different ways to come to the same outcome. There's also a million different ways to introduce contamination and destroy your results, but that's just a part of this process. Because we're working with microbes, we have to be ready for the results of molds. Molds, different types of fungi that overtake the mycelium, it's super common. So if you see that on something that you're trying to cultivate out, don't get discouraged, just throw it into the compost. It's gonna be great for the compost. It happens all the time. A really, really successful mushroom grower will typically be under 10% contamination rate, which is really good. But as a novice grower, you're probably gonna be somewhere around 90%. So just prepare for that. Like I've gone to Danielle multiple times like, oh, I'm done. There's no more, I can't do it. But it inoculated me, so I can't stop. This is where I would recommend most people start trying to identify and learn and get in touch with mushrooms. Spore prints. I didn't plan on doing this, but it was actually in a calendar. It was like in one of my planner notebooks. So that was the actual date that I took the spore print, and I was like, dang, that was genius. I wasn't even thinking of that. But I really like that, carrying around a notebook that has the actual dates, and you can actually take the spore print on the date and then document the species right next to the spore print. I think that's a really cool way to save genetics ultimately. And I'll explain how you can ultimately expand this to grow out too. But I think it's just a cool way to get to know mushrooms better. We really need to get in touch with mushrooms more as a society. We're a super young society and we're really mycophobic still. To be honest, I've been poisoned way more by plants foraging mushrooms than I have foraging plants or getting poisoned by mushrooms foraging plants. Plants are way scarier to me, to be honest, than mushrooms. I've seen people eat so-called toxic species with no ill effects. I'm not recommending this, obviously, but I think the mycophobia needs to die down a little bit because they're not as intense as we make them out to be. Even the poisonous ones, they can be introduced to the body in really easy ways through just like simple preparations. So this picture in the middle here, that was an oyster mushroom experiment that I will explain in great detail further on in this presentation. But that is like my pride and joy for like a citizen scientist experiment. And I'll explain that in just a sec. You just need a little faith and creativity. Alejandro Carrillo, he was presenting at the Agri Summit, and he said this, and it just struck such a deep chord with me. He said, remember, this is mostly art and part science. And he said this about his cattle ranch. But I think that it is applicable to all types of like agriculture, especially citizen scientists. Like, this is where you can get creative. You can experiment with all these different things that people say won't work, maybe even prove that they will work. Because a lot of times the people that say they won't work are just the brokenhearted. So, and a lot of times they haven't even tried. So I believe I have a better picture of this deeper on in the slide, but that's an oyster mushroom that was colonized on cardboard in a dirty Pyrex in my closet. So it's a lot easier. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, so it's easier than people make it out to be. It's also difficult, so be prepared for contamination, but don't overthink it. The mycelium is way more intelligent than we are. It knows what it's doing. Understanding mycelium. This got cut off a little bit. That's okay. So some species will do great in your garden, and some species may not. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to talk throughout this presentation about mycorrhizal species versus saprophytic species. And the saprophytic species are typically the ones that will be growing out, and typically the ones that you'll actually see growing out in the wild. The mycorrhizal species are typically the ones that are like doing the work underneath the soil that we don't typically like see fruiting bodies from. That's not necessarily true. There's ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal. There is a difference. The fungi compost guys are probably a little bit more knowledgeable about the mycorrhizal part of this than I am, to be honest. So I would highly recommend checking out their booth. So something that I just want like you guys to remember is that mycelium has adapted for a really, really long time to be symbiotic. Although there is saprophytic species, I think ultimately everything is symbiotic, working with each other. So it's important not to think of these things as just saprophytes, just sucking nutrients. They're not just leeches, they're working towards some sort of greater purpose to close loops. And I think mushrooms are the greatest at closing loops. Growing mushrooms, it just becomes easier and easier to close more loops. You're growing things on people that would normally, things that people would normally throw away. Oyster mushrooms will colonize trash. It will colonize paper products. Like there's these things that people just throw in the garbage that you can literally use to grow mushrooms. Mushrooms are one of the easiest ways in my life that I've found that I can close loops. And I think closing loops is super, super important because we can't have all of these things just ending up in the landfill. And there's bioremediation projects that could potentially help this, but ultimately the less we can put in there, the better, and the more we can reutilize things. I've seen people using their plastic bottles that they find. There's this guy that just harvested 100,000 plastic bottles. The implications of the chemical input are pretty weird, but he's using all these bottles to cultivate out all of his grain spawn. So there's things that like we can be utilizing all this plastic waste that's already going. Just get creative. This is an art and a science, but we're mostly artists. Some people a lot of mycologists would probably be mad that I said that, but I truly believe that like I'm more of an artist than a scientist. So working with fungi indoors is much different than working with fungi outdoors. If you're getting something like this, it's taken into a lab, a sterile environment, and that is super important that it stays sterile inside, which really breaks the concept of how they're growing outside. Because outside, they're working in symbiosis with all this bacteria, all these things that you would normally like not want in your indoor lab. So this is like, in my opinion, the hard work. If you can outsource this, this is the easiest way to get it into your garden. This is a lot of labor. It's cheap to do, relatively cheap, but it's a lot of labor. So if you can get somebody that's already doing this indoors in a sterile environment, it's a lot easier than jumping in full on and being like, all right, I'm going to do everything from spore, everything from live culture. Just get something that somebody's already done that work with, like ready to go. That was a lot of work that guy put in. Just get that bag, it's ready to go. Otherwise, like it is really fun to get into cultivation. I'm definitely not trying to turn anybody away. So yeah, it can be used for a lot of different things. It's being used for biodiesel now, which is like one of the coolest concepts to me. So there's different types of mycorrhizal fungi. Typically I think the way to think of this is just whatever is happening in nature. So if you go out into a patch of nature, it's all of these pictures explain pretty well There's dandelions growing, there's grasses growing, there's a bunch of leaf litter, there's tons of different perennials growing around these. And this is like where mycorrhizal fungi really comes into play. It's attaching to plant roots and it's helping the plants survive while the plants are also like symbiotically helping the fungi. So it's really cool because the fungi actually allow the plants to communicate, help the plants to communicate more so through electromagnetic signaling through the mycelium underground. And I think this is a lot of like why it's so beneficial is it's actually allowing better communication between beings. So there's ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal. You don't really need to know the difference between those. I'm kind of going to glance over mycorrhizal fungi because it's not as important in your garden space. This is more so what you would find in nature, but the implications of taking inoculum from nature and trying to recreate ecosystems that you found in nature, I think are massive. And I think that's going to be like kind of the future of cultivation is trying to cultivate these wild species that nobody's been able to cultivate out yet. My mentor is cultivating morels, and so many people are like, morels are mycorrhizal, you cannot cultivate those. Technically, they're kind of saprophytic more than mycorrhizal. But he figured it out, and there's multiple people, like in China, they've had it figured out for decades. So, I mean, there's ways to do these things. We just haven't really been innovative enough as citizen scientists. So I just implore you guys to get creative and to start asking like a lot of questions, like what if I did this? Like what would that do? What would this inoculum do for my garden? Would it hinder my annuals, or like is it going to like benefit all my perennials? Like what's happening in this natural ecosystem, and how can I recreate what's happening? So this is really cool. Mycorrhizal systems can extend a plant's root system by upwards of roughly 1,000 times. I'll have a photo of this with like a little patch of grass, but I've seen photos of this side by side with native grasses versus like cultivated grasses. The native grass goes like 25 feet down, and the cultivated grass is just like 6 inches down or something. It's like unbelievable difference. So that mycorrhizae is allowing it to get better access to nutrients, better access to water. It's literally secreting enzymes that are breaking down rock and inorganic material that is inaccessible to, or organic material that's inaccessible to the plants. Making that accessible to the plants are then feeding the fungi as well. It's a really beautiful symbiotic relationship. I think this is how we need to be thinking about our relationship with nature too. How can we be more symbiotic, and how can we see ourselves less as saprophytic and more as mycorrhizal? This is absolutely necessary for all plant, animal, and human life on this planet. Like they estimate that 92-ish% of all plant life requires mycorrhizal fungi to survive. There's a couple of different like exceptions with annual production, specifically with brassicasias, where it gets kind of weird. But other than that, almost everything relies on mycorrhizal fungi, and we're stepping on it every day. Like within 1 footstep, I think it's 300 miles of mycelium. It's really, really remarkable what is going on under our feet. All right, so this is the mushroom-plant relationship. I just explained all that, really. Here's the picture I was talking about with the mycorrhizal versus the non-mycorrhizal. You could just see a clear difference. Yeah, upwards of 1,000 times. Higher transplanting success. You get better moisture, better access to water, but you actually get better like water retention as well, because you're getting like this spongy material. It totally makes sense. It's like slowing the water. And if you think of permaculture concepts, you're like slow it, spread it, sink it. That's what mycelium is doing. Increases hard to reach nutrients, increases plants' chances of survival during drought, which is super important to think about out here, because we might go through seasons where we're going to see like super little rainfall. This may be our solution. Creates networks that allow plants to communicate and play together. Without this, we definitely would not be here. Some popular mycorrhizal species, there's an Amanita muscaria right there, the hawkswing, the morel. And like I said, the morel is actually more so considered saprophytic now because it's decaying more so than like living in the soil. And those are the first things that you'll see after like a massive burn site too. Like if you see a burn area, the morels are typically the first things kind of bioremediating that area. So tip to any morel foragers out there. Yeah, so these are some of the ones that grow abundantly here. There's tons of boletes, chanterelles, hedgehogs. Some people call them hedgehogs. I don't like to know them as hedgehogs. They're known as hawkswing to me because hedgehogs are a different type of mushroom. but people here know them as hedgehogs. Saffron milky caps, those are unmistakable. They're a Lactaria species that you would split in the middle and they just start exudating this white milkiness. The matsutakis, I know Asian families that will like kill you over their matsutake spot. I'm just kidding, they're not that extreme. But they love their matsutake spot, they will not give them out. So yeah, morels are great. Yeah, the burn areas for those. The Amanita muscaria is actually the Colorado state mushroom. And I would highly recommend everybody trying to formulate a relationship with this mushroom. She's a super beautiful spirit. And there is a lot of guidance from this mushroom that we need in our society today. It is a very powerful hallucinogenic compound. And it's a very misled, misinformed mushroom. People think this will kill you. It typically will not. I'm not promoting anybody eat it, but I recommend you formulate a relationship with this mushroom. Just being around it is medicinal. Just seeing it in the wild is medicinal. It feels like you're in a different dimension or a different world when you stumble across a fairy ring. That in and of itself sparks some healing. I can't speak highly enough about this mushroom. I use it in my own, for my own health benefits, but I prepare it in a very specific way. So I would not recommend for the novice to get straight into that. Symbiosis. I mean, you can see it clearly in these photos. Like, these things are all relying on each other. I could not take this boletus and just inoculate it in my garden. Like, I don't have all of that uva-ursi. I don't have all those pine cones. I don't have like that 5 years of leaf litter that's sitting there. Just think about like the microenvironments. Think about the microclimates that it's growing in. If we can recreate this, we can probably extend mycorrhizal species into our spaces. So I think the implications there are absolutely astounding. If you could have boletus and amanita popping up on your property, not living in the mountains, like that would be extremely powerful. So yeah, different types of grasses. Just think about what's happening in nature. Biomimicry is what's going to change this planet. Oh, dang. Okay. Holy smokes. All right. I'm going to start cruising. All right. This always happens. Dang it. All right. Okay, I'm just going to get into some super cool examples. Like, I'm just going to throw these at you. These are things that I've done. These are things that will work. These are things that you can experiment with. This is a human manure composting pile. It was not inoculated with anything. So this is a type of shaggy mane. It's also sometimes known as an inky cap. Those are different mushrooms, but they both decompose poop. So the fact that I did not inoculate this really surprises me that it just ended up in there. But it also does not surprise me because mycelium is hyper intelligent. It knows where it's spreading its spores. It knows where it needs to go. It knows what it's doing. It inoculated this pile knowingly. I did nothing to it. We let it sit. That's what happened. So I'm going to start producing spawn to decompose poop. So I know there's a lot of people working with human manure composting systems out here. If you're working with a human manure composting system, I would highly recommend inoculating that with something that's going to eat that super fast and make it non-contaminant. Make it a non-contaminant. Remove all those toxins. Like, if your mycelium is eating the human manure compost, I don't want to say that you have a good product at the end, but knowing what I know about fungi, I'm pretty sure you're going to have a pretty good product at the end. This was an oyster that I took from the river on the ark and threw onto some cardboard and then put into a soma tube. That was 2 weeks later. I'm gonna go straight past this. If you're cultivating oyster mushrooms, cultivate the pearl oyster in your garden. The blue oyster strangles nematodes. It's a carnivorous mycelium. It could actually potentially be problematic in your garden. I don't want to say that it is problematic, but it's something to think about. They actually do strangle nematodes. So they have this mechanism where the end of the fungal hyphae will draw the nematode in and close it and then suck the nutrients from the nematode. Much like a cordyceps would be would be taking over like an insect. So I would highly recommend yellow or golden oysters or pearl oysters. Pearl oysters are, in my opinion, the easiest to grow outdoors here passively on straw bales. The yellow oysters will also do good. The king oysters do great, but they need high CO2 levels, so low fresh air exchange. The elm oyster is actually not an oyster, but it's known as the elm oyster, and it's also easy to grow. So I would focus on the pearl, the yellow, and the elm if you are trying to cultivate in your garden. So, possible substrates. This is where it gets really crazy because oysters will eat almost anything. Get creative here. Make sure your substrate is not toxic. Make sure it does not have a toxic material in it. Make sure it does not have inks. Make sure it doesn't have any oil spills on it. Oils from like sunflower oil or something like that are fine, but like diesel oil or something like that. Make sure there's nothing like that that would ever allow the mushrooms to bioremediate that and end up in your fruiting bodies. So just think about what it's growing on because they are hyperaccumulators. They're accumulating heavy metals, they're accumulating toxins, they're accumulating pharmaceutical waste. Think about what you're growing on. So they'll grow on straw, paper, cardboard, wood mulch, leaf mulch, compost, old socks, gross shoes, pallets, decaying barnwood. Like, get creative. These things will eat almost anything. I've seen people cultivate them out on teddy bears. I've seen them eat almost anything. It's so remarkable what these things will learn how to grow on and actually fruit out too. I wouldn't recommend eating those mushrooms after they bioremediated those certain toxins. But there's actually a study that just came out last month that shows that that could totally be the opposite. So look into that study. That's really cool. So this is my prized slide. This is what I want to show you guys. This was my oyster experiment. I found this on the Ark in Salida. I pulled it off. I felt a deep duty to cultivate this mushroom because somebody else went and harvested this mushroom and decimated the log after me because I didn't do my due diligence and show them how to harvest it properly. Never harvest it and rip the bark off. It always needs that microclimate under the bark to fruit. If you rip that bark off, it will not fruit for anymore. It won't fruit anymore. The mycelium won't be able to have a place to survive.
Cut them off, right?
Yes.
Cut them, even when you're harvesting in the wild.
Yeah.
Cut it and leave the roots.
Well, that's a deep rabbit hole. There's actually studies showing that if you pull the mushroom out, the full root system, it actually stimulates the mycorrhizae. So there's a lot of nuance to this. Like, if you're told something, don't take it as fact. Like, even the things that I'm telling you, do your own research. Like, think about these things deeper because these things are constantly changing. Even the names of mushrooms change every year, like the Latin names, and it becomes super confusing. But that's what science is. It's ever adapting. It's never constant. Yes, thank you for getting me back on track. So, felt a deep duty to cultivate this. I need that. So this was the oyster patch that I got. It looked beautiful. So this is what I did. I boiled some cardboard. That's all I did. Boiled cardboard, put it in a Ziploc bag, and then brought that to the river because I knew that would be there. That day, we had that boiled cardboard in the Ziploc bag. I think I actually had it in my car for like 2 days before that. So I put a little piece of one of these caps of that mushroom in the cardboard with the Ziploc bag, and it started to colonize in the Ziploc bag. So I was like, I need to expand this. I boiled more cardboard, put more cardboard into a Pyrex container that I didn't even wash. It was dirty. It was a dirty Pyrex that we had food in, like from a week ago or something. There wasn't like mold or anything, but it's not like, it didn't have to be sterile. It didn't have to be like cleaned out before this. I put it in my closet, it colonized a week later. This was in our 5th wheel. I think it was like 40, like the temperature fluctuation was like 40 to like 80. And they'll say that you need like a constant 70 degrees to fruit out mycelium. That is definitely not the case. It is really resilient. You may get a lot of genetic variation and you wouldn't want to cultivate like that consistently, but it's possible. So threw it into the closet, it colonized. After it colonized, I threw it into a straw basket from Whole Foods. I used to work at Whole Foods, so I had this basket left over. Just filled it with straw, and I just kept it wet. I didn't even pasteurize the straw. This was so low tech. It was so easy. I put this mushroom in a Ziploc bag, put it in the Pyrex, put it in the straw, and a Soma tube, and they both worked. And this was completely off-grid. We were hand watering the entire time. No rain. Yeah, very, very, very low input. Go ahead.
What's a Soma tube?
It's an old paper tube, so they're like this tall, and they come with like big rolls of paper. You can get them for free in Salida, like in huge quantities. So I just stuffed a bunch of cardboard in the soma tube and then put that mycelium in the soma tube, put the burlap over it, and just kept it wet. It was super easy, and it fruited a week later. So I saved this genetic. And this is like the technique if you want to get stuff expanded straight from nature into your garden. It's super simple. You literally just put it onto cardboard. Once the cardboard is colonized, then you expand that cardboard onto straw, onto wood, onto paper products, old socks. I have this plan to do bioremediation projects at the landfill, and I really want to inoculate all these old shoes and stuff and this gross stuff to show that it's actually possible that oysters will start breaking them down. There's this experimenting with cultivation group on Facebook that has inspired me every day to do stuff like this because people are doing it. So it's easy. That's what I want you to get away from this. It's not as hard as people make it out to be. You can literally just take a wild species, expand it into your garden just like this, just on cardboard. Like, that is so simple and cool to me. So the wine cap mushroom. This is the mushroom that you want to buy online via spawn. In 2 months, we will have the spawn available at our spot. So I'm planning on producing all of this spawn so that none of you have to outsource this if you're in the valley. I want to get this local to everybody to get into their gardens. So we will have it at our spot within 2 months in large quantities for people to come pick up and to inoculate their own garden beds. The wine cap mushroom is one that I would highly recommend looking into if you're growing corn or any type of annuals, honestly. Corn, squash, beans, they do really well. Although they are saprophytic, they do really well with these things. So they're saprophytic, meaning they're breaking down wood chips. If you inoculate this one, just throw it onto your wood chips, wood chip heavily, keep it wet. Usually within at least 1 year, you'll see fruiting bodies. And if you don't see fruiting bodies within the first year, keep it wet and keep faith, because a lot of times the mycelium does take a long time, and then over a winter it will go dormant, and then during the spring it will come back. So you could inoculate now with a wine cap species and maybe not see them till next year. So just keep having faith that the mycelium is doing its work and just leave it alone. Yeah, go ahead.
Will you talk into the mic, please, because we're recording this?
Oh, nice.
You said something about the mushroom that actually decomposes poop. Is it possible for that to grow within septic tanks?
Yeah, so I think there's massive implications to this. I think we should be inoculating not only our human manure compost, but all of our waste, all of our poop. Why not? And if you have huge manure piles at home too from like animals, this is an easy application to grow poop lovers. There's various different species of dung lovers. If you're into psilocybin, this is a phenomenal route. They love dung. They naturally grow, some psilocybin species naturally grow on dung. So that might be a rabbit hole to jump into for that. I'll throw a little tidbit out there. If you're trying to get them in your garden, go for the cyanescence. Cool. So it helps the bees. Paul Stamets has a lot of studies on this mushroom specifically, and it's feeding the bees, upgrading their detox pathway, allowing them to protect themselves from the varroa mite attacks. Massive implications to this. I think everybody needs to try to start implementing these things in their gardens to save pollinators. So these are working on microscopic levels. They're actually upgrading immune systems of not only us, but the environment. Insects are benefiting. All of the pollinators are benefiting. The nematodes are typically benefiting. Like, it's a very symbiotic thing that's happening. Cultivating morels, it can be done. If you buy the spawn, cut X's in the bags and place them upside down on the ground. That bag being cut upside down, so if you cut an X like this, you just place the bag right on top of the soil there. What that will do will create microclimates in here for the mycelium to start expanding underground. But you got to start thinking like, what would a morel grow around? Like, do you have aspens around? Do you have like a burn area potentially? This could be like a great place to inoculate morels. They do good in hoop houses. So it is possible. I would highly recommend looking into morels if you're excited about that. Companion plants and fungi. So I mentioned earlier a lot of brassicas actually won't do well with mycorrhizal fungi. There's a lot of new studies coming out on that. I don't really know the full science on it, but I know that a lot of brassicasias are actually harmed by mycorrhizal fungi. So if you're planting an annual bed, it might not be the best thing to add like a saprophytic species to your garden. That would be more for like a compost situation to help break it down faster, right? So with saprophytic fungi, if you're looking for fruiting results, continually feed it every year. It should be breaking down that the wood chips or whatever it's decomposing every single year to the point that you don't really see a bottom layer anymore. It's just going to be a mycelial mat. Just keep giving it food, which is wood chips, or leaf matter, or various different things. Get creative. Utilize what's around you. The beautiful thing about mushroom cultivation is that you can utilize things. There's a local sawmill you can go to, pick up real cheap buckets of sawdust. A lot of people give their paper shreds out. If you go to a local coffee spot that goes through a lot of coffee, get their coffee grounds. You can grow oysters on coffee grounds. It's a beautiful nitrogen supplement for lion's mane even, or a lot of different mushrooms. So get creative with the stuff you have. The easy inoculation techniques. So I talked about the cardboard. Slurry tech. It's super, super simple. A great way to think about this is the mushroom is constantly producing a ton of spores. So what you can do is throw these spores, throw the whole fruiting body, whole mushroom into your blender. If you have old mushrooms, this is the best way to get them in your compost, especially for the poop lovers. Throw them all into a blender. The more water, the better, because the more you'll be able to disperse the spores. You blend it up, you have a spore slurry. You have trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of spores in this spore slurry. I haven't seen people have amazing success with it yet, but I think there's massive implications to this tech. It's really, really simple. You can go get a patch of oysters from the grocery store, throw them in your blender, never even mess with an inoculation bag, and just pour it on what you want to inoculate. Very, very simple. Pre-inoculated grain, that's your next simplest bet. This is super abundant now. They're typically $30 a bag, and then you have to pay for like $20 in shipping. That's why I want to get these to you guys locally, because it'd be way cheaper ultimately for everybody. Mushroom to mulch. That's like the easiest way just to remember what it's going to be eating. Just add it to your mulch piles. Bury mindfully. What I mean by that is bury it in a place that's not going to get blasted by sun. These things need high humidity. They need to stay wet, so try to keep them wet. Full shade, they'll do amazing. They need no sunlight basically to fruit. I've had full fruiting bodies in complete darkness before. Expanding your mycelium patches. This is why I think it's really cool actually to use these because it has a better success rate. You have a little bit more material to work with. If you get a mother patch going in your garden, you have that mycelium for life. You can expand that forever. So this could be a $30 to $50 investment for you, and you'll have mushrooms forever. So they're doing the work underground. You'll have this mother patch just as long as you keep the mycelium alive, even if there's not fruiting bodies. Keep expanding it. Just keep moving it to different wood chip piles. Keep moving it to different mulch piles. Even add to that mulch pile until you can move it. Just the same way you could disseminate worms, you could disseminate this mycelium. Just keep it going. Like establish a mother patch, and that mother patch will last you your whole life as long as you're in that garden. You can train your mycelium to grow on your substrates. Mycelium learns. So mycelium will learn to grow on your specific substrate that you give it. To an extent, oyster mushrooms can be trained to grow on almost anything. So get creative. Yeah.
Is it on? Oh, there it is. Can mushrooms overcome chlorine in the water?
Beautiful question. The greatest bioremediator for mushrooms specifically of chlorine is psilocybin. Please educate your grower about not growing in tap water. That is really, really important. Mushrooms bioremediate heavy metals and contaminants. So what they're doing is they're breaking down chlorine levels. I never use tap water in any of my mushroom substrates because I know that's going to be leached up into the mushrooms. It's not okay with me. So great question, for sure. Chlorine definitely affects mushrooms.
What about ashes as a substrate?
I've seen biochar have really good success. So I don't know about like ash from like your fireplace, but I have seen biochar get inoculated faster than almost anything else. It is like specifically the dust, it really, really likes that fine powder. And to go with that, spawn is great to use with biochar because you need to inoculate your biochar. So if you're getting an inoculum, you can get your biochar so that inoculum can actually inoculate that biochar and that substrate. And that biochar will be super nutrient dense. It will have all these colonization points for the mycelium, benefit your soil forever.
I want to mention too that if you get the fungi compost and mix that with your biochar, that's a great way to inoculate that biochar.
Exactly. Question?
Have you heard of the long-lasting herbicides, and that can go generations through the animal and into your compost pile, and then they call it killer compost?
Yeah, like PFOAs and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So these are one of the few things that we're discovering can actually break down these compounds to the point that they're reusable again as organic material, which is really powerful. It hasn't been studied enough for me to say that it's like possible for every chemical, but I know that there's tons of studies that are showing great benefit to break down forever chemicals. Thank you. Okay, where there is mycelium, there is hope, for sure. Bioremediation projects. If you guys know mycologists, please have them reach out to me. I cannot do this alone. I have a massive bioremediation project in mind. Before they start this new cell in the landfill, I really want to inoculate the bottom of it with oyster mushrooms. I will need so much help to create that amount of spawn, so I really implore you guys to like start dabbling in this if you want to help, or try to reach out to a mycologist and tell them to reach out to me, because I really want to spearhead this before it gets going, and I think it's 2 years is the plan. So it needs to get going fast. There's definitely hope for the future. The beautiful paradox of growing mushrooms is that the more people that grow mushrooms, the more demand there is for mushrooms. Because the more knowledge there is around mushrooms, the less mycophobia there is around mushrooms, the more healing benefits we're seeing from mushrooms. My mentor, Gary from Fresh from the Farm Fungi, said that, and it really hit hard. I really believe, I want to encourage everybody to start dabbling in this. I really want this presentation to be taken as something that is applicable for you to take home right now. Like, I can go inoculate some cardboard. I can boil this cardboard and just put a mushroom on it from the store. Really easy. Just get my mycelium expanded. You can do it. This is a quote from Paul Stamets, and it's very probably overused, but it's very profound. We need to have a paradigm shift in our consciousness. If we don't get our act together and come in commonality and understanding with the organisms that sustain us today, not only will we destroy these organisms, but we will destroy ourselves, because ultimately we're an extension of those organisms. Very, very important to try to get mycelium in your garden, to try to think about mycelium, to try to just immerse yourself in the mycoverse that is mycelium. Just think about how much it's doing. Even if it's not constantly, just give it acknowledgement. Maybe like once a day, just be like, oh, thank you. Like you're just doing so much work and you're just not very acknowledged. So it's just such a profound thing happening. I really want us to I don't know why this happened, but I really want us to transform from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And I think mushrooms are going to allow us to do this in a really healthy way. They're easy to expand. And instead of thinking about how much we've destroyed, think about how much potential there is to heal. So that's something that I started studying sustainability, and I was so depressed. I was like, there's no way I can I already am searching these rabbit holes and seeing how effed up everything is. And it's really disconcerting to me. So this is one of the few things that I truly believe has the power to help on the capacity that we need it to. Like, this is so powerful. I want to just spend my life, honestly, like getting people excited about it, because it is such a profound thing that's happening. It's a food source for us. There's an amazing meta study that came out last year. It showed that cultures that eat mushrooms 3 to 5 times per week have a 46% reduction in their all dementia-related illnesses. That is super powerful, all the way down to the button mushroom. One thing I want to add to that is never eat mushrooms raw, ever. Always cook them. They are potentially actually harmful to your gut. If you have studied lectins, and what they do is like nutrient binders to the gut, the chitin, which is the cell wall of the mushroom, acts in a very, very similar way. It will actually bind nutrients in the gut. Specifically, there's this type of slime that grows on the agaricus that could be carcinogenic. Just always cook your mushrooms. Always. There's 3 species in the whole world, I think, that usually are eaten raw, and I'm not even going to name them because I don't want anybody dabbling in it. Like, just cook them. Yeah.
Does drying them stop that?
No. Drying them is not enough to break down the chitin in the mushroom. If you're thinking about psilocybin, disregard everything I just said. You need to extract that in a totally different way, and you can sometimes eat those raw. But that's also why people get digestive pain, is because you're not supposed to eat them raw. But the heat will degrade the psilocybin. Typically, if you're breaking down the chitin walls, you want heat, but that's going to break down your psilocybin. Psilocybin, I'll give you guys a hint, you actually want cold. So if you use ice water, that's your best way to extract. Very counterintuitive. Cool. Are there any other questions that you guys have? Yeah.
Maybe the mic recording this.
When people, when there's chocolate bars and things like that with psilocybin, would that technically destroy it by that process of cooking it within chocolate?
It depends on how much it's heated. The heat will denature it, but only to an extent. If it's over like 175, 185-ish, you're going to start seeing problems. Like you're going to start seeing massive degradation. If you have access to a freeze dryer, that is by far the best.
They mentioned dried mushrooms. I've got some wild mushrooms that I dried. Can they be a source for culture, or do we have to use fresh mushroom?
My mentor pulled out a dried mushroom culture from a species that I gave him from like 5 years prior.
Okay,
So it's possible, but it's hard. I've never successfully done it. I would recommend if you have a species like that, try to see if there's spores left. If there are spores left, there's definitely a chance that you can save those.
Last quick question. So past decade, I've seen all types of garden additives, mycorrhiza. Positive, negative, do you have any idea what kind of mushroom that is, or just go with it, or
It's
trust it, or-
usually a blend of a bunch of different mycorrhizal species. And the fungi compost guys, I bet, would know a lot more than I do about what's happening on the mycorrhizal level. I know a lot about the saprophytic level because that's what that's like the culinary species. Those are the things that we're cultivating out typically. So yeah, it's usually a bunch of different inoculum, and it's usually things that don't have fruiting bodies. So sometimes it's stuff that you wouldn't even see in your soil, or in your, like, you wouldn't see ever fruiting body come from it, Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you all.